Hey guys, and thanks for stopping on in for today's video where I want to go through and give my way too early Senate election prediction map and projecting where I currently have things standing for the 2020 Senate races. Now, of the 34 seats that are up for grabs, I think around 13 could be within the realm of being competitive and are worth talking about. So what I'm going to do is go through and talk about these 13 separate races and give my current leaning either towards the Democrats or Republicans at this early on juncture. And then at the end of the video, I'll have my final tally of total Democrats in the Senate, total Republicans in the Senate to see who's in the majority. Now, the Democrats had a brutally tough map in the midterms of 2018 for the Senate. That gets flipped on its head in 2020. Now, of these 13 possibly competitive races, 10 of them are currently held by Republicans compared to only 3 that are currently held by the Democrats. And 2 of the ones that are held by Democrats, I don't really think are in all that much danger, but could be a bit more competitive than some of these other democratically held Senate seats. So to start things off, I'm going to work my way from west to east. So the first state I want to talk about here is Montana, one of the few states that has one Democratic and one Republican senator. Now, if we're looking at the numbers, the Republican senator incumbent Steve Daines, who is running for re-election in 2020, has much better overall net approval in the state of Montana than what the Democratic senator has, Jon Tester, who just went on and won his re-election bid back in 2018. Now, I think this would be a much more interesting and competitive matchup if the Democratic governor, Steve Bullock, went on to run on the Democratic side. Currently, he's testing the waters and running for the presidential nomination for the Democratic Party. He could probably serve his party a lot better if he ran in this Senate race. We don't know if he's going to do that. So at this point in time, we're going to be giving this one as a pretty good lean over to the Republicans. Now, moving on down to the state of Arizona, I think this one's actually looking pretty good for the Democrats. So in 2018, the Democrats won the statewide Senate race with Kyrsten Sinema taking down Martha McSally. McSally was actually appointed to the other Senate seat that's in the state of Arizona, and she's going to have to run and win the election in 2020 if she's going to keep that. Now, on the Democrat side, you have the astronaut Mark Kelly, who's done a phenomenal job in fundraising, and I think he could be an even tougher challenger if it ends up being Martha McSally that he runs against than what even Kyrsten Sinema was to McSally back in 2018. I'm going to have this one as leaning over towards the Democrats right now, which would be a pickup for them, which currently having this one being a Republican seat. So then we're moving on over to the state of Colorado, and the American Southwest has been very good to the Democratic Party in recent election cycles. Now, Colorado is another one of these states that has one Republican and one Democratic senator. The Republican senator, Cory Gardner, the incumbent, is running for re-election. His net approval numbers are some of the worst in the Senate right now. Colorado is a state that is trending in a Democratic direction, and statewide races typically go to Democrats. In Colorado, it's been very consistent in recent election cycles. We don't know who the Democratic challenger is going to be or who's going to be the party nominee. If it's a very weak candidate, that's Cory Gardner's obviously best chance to go on and win this one. But if it's a reasonably agreed upon candidate on the Democratic side, especially in a presidential year where you'd probably expect the Democratic presidential nominee to go on and win Colorado statewide, that could also raise the tide of the Senate candidate doing a bit better. I think that this one also is just a slight lean over to the Democrats in what's probably going to be a relatively competitive race. Moving over to the state of Kansas. Now, typically, this is a pretty safe Republican situation, but Kansas is a little bit different than some of these other Great Plains states. We saw a Democrat win the governorship statewide in 2018, going against Republican nominee Chris Kobach, and that is a best-case scenario for the Democrats in the state of Kansas in 2020 because Kobach is running in the Republican primary. So if Kobach goes on and wins the nomination for the Republicans, that opens up the door and presents a great opportunity for the Democrats to potentially steal a seat from the state of Kansas where they typically would not win those statewide races on the federal level. A little bit different in contrast to maybe the statewide races on the state level in the state legislature, such as the governor's race that they were able to pick up in 2018. But also the presidential race could be pretty competitive in Kansas as well. Maybe Trump isn't able to rise the tide for the Republican nominee quite as strongly as a typical Republican presidential candidate might be able to do in a state like Kansas. But still, at the end of the day, even if it is Kobach, you probably still give just a slight lean to the Republicans here. But if it's somebody other than Kobach that's more agreeable to the vast majority of Republican and conservative leaning independent voters, then you're probably going to be giving a decent lean in the state of Kansas to the Republicans. Now going down to the state of Texas, where we had a fascinating Senate race in the midterms of 2018, where Beto O'Rourke only came up a couple of points short against Ted Cruz. Now, if Beto O'Rourke doesn't win the Democratic presidential nomination, which I think he's a very long shot at this point in time, if he decides to run for this Senate seat, I actually think that makes things very interesting, competitive, maybe goes right down to the wire in a 50-50 scenario. If it's not Beto O'Rourke, it probably is a little bit tougher potentially for the Democrats to challenge in this one, but this is a state here in the American Southwest where we've seen this trend where the Democrats continue to do better. It feels like it's only a matter of time before the Democrats go on and start winning some of these statewide races in Texas. Maybe it's not in 2020, but probably sometime within the next decade or so. And Beto O'Rourke did a lot of positive work for the Democratic Party in 2018, registering a lot of new Democratic voters, which should carry over and have benefits here going in to 2020. Now, John Cornyn, the incumbent Republican, he doesn't have quite as much in terms of high disapproval as Ted Cruz, but he also doesn't quite have as much in terms of his approval as well. Not quite as well known across the state in contrast to Cruz, but still at the end of the day, going to be giving this one as a lean over to the Republicans with that incumbency advantage. And we don't quite know who's going to be winning on the Democratic side as the party nominee. Now going up and talking about a Midwestern state, Iowa, where you have an incumbent Republican, Joni Ernst. Now, Iowa is one of these states where we see big swings one way or the other. It's the first caucus state. It's very politically active because of that. And the minds can change of these voters. We saw that if we go back to 2008, Obama won by around 10 percentage points. 8 years later, Trump wins the state by around 10 percentage points. That is a massive swing from one party to the other in a presidential election. So we can see these swings in a state like Iowa. We'll see what happens in the presidential realm, but here in the Senate, Joni Ernst has the incumbency advantage. Now, her net approval ratings are also not very good, kind of more so in the vein of somebody like a Cory Gardner, but just a little bit better in terms of her overall net approval in contrast to Gardner. But still, nonetheless, it's not like she has really solid numbers to stand on that she can come into as just a serious favorite, likely to be competitive on the presidential side. That probably carries over into this Senate matchup. We don't know who the Democratic nominee is going to be. Somebody that I'd like to see running on the Democratic side, maybe somebody like a J.D. Scholten, who did extremely well in the most conservative congressional district. Now, he lost by just a couple percentage points, but if he ran, for instance, on the statewide level and was able to outperform in the most conservative district and do about as well in the rest of the districts in Iowa as you would assume a Democrat could do, that would give him a great opportunity to possibly upset and win this Senate seat away from somebody like a Joni Ernst. But we'll see who the Democrats go on and put in this situation as the party nominee. But at this point in time, I'm going to be giving the slight lean over to the Republicans and the incumbent Joni Ernst until we get some more polling or know who's going to be the nominee on the Democratic side. Moving down into the southeast, the state of Alabama, and it's not a Republican incumbent. It's actually a Democratic incumbent, that being Doug Jones. He won the special election against Roy Moore, a vastly different scenario this time around in terms of it being a presidential election situation, which is likely to make it a bit tougher for Doug Jones because with Trump running for re-election in 2020, you would assume he's going to win Alabama in a landslide, and that's likely to carry downward to this Senate race down ballot and prop up whoever the Republican nominee is going to be. Now, Roy Moore is running again to try to win this party nominee. If he wins it, that is Doug Jones' best case scenario to try to win his re-election bid. But even if it is Roy Moore, the fact that it's a presidential election situation and Trump can rise the tide of all of the other Republicans down ballot, that could still put somebody like a Roy Moore in the U.S. Senate taking down Doug Jones. Again, that's Doug Jones' best case scenario if it is Roy Moore that he is going against. But even in that situation, you still might even give the lean over to the Republicans in what is one of the most Republican-heavy leaning states out of all the 50 United States. Moving over one state to Georgia, we have a Republican incumbent with David Perdue. Now, I think the Democrats' best case scenario here is if Stacey Abrams were to run for this Senate seat. She did extremely well in the governor's race in 2018. She only came up short by a couple of percentage points. I think it would be a highly competitive situation between Abrams and Perdue. Again, we don't know who's going to be the party nominee on the Democrat side. And Perdue, he has the incumbency advantage going for him. Now, Georgia is one of these southeastern states that's trending in a Democratic direction, and a lot of that has to do with the suburban areas in and around the metropolitan area of Atlanta, which is just a massive population center, more so in the state of Georgia than a lot of these other Republican southeastern states have. And because of that major city hub, that makes Georgia a bit more competitive on the statewide level. And we'll see how that plays out in this Senate race, likely to be very close, but giving the lean right now to the incumbent Republican, David Perdue. Now moving on up to the state of North Carolina, where we have another Republican incumbent situation with Thom Tillis running for re-election. We don't know who the Democratic nominee is going to be. Now, North Carolina, a very purple state, highly competitive in these statewide races. The Democrats showed that they could win statewide when they won the governorship. It was highly competitive between Trump and Clinton back in 2016. It's likely again to be very competitive in the 2020 presidential race. Now, Thom Tillis, not one of the stronger incumbents that the Republicans have running in terms of his approval numbers. The most recent numbers that we got out of the Morning Consult, he actually has the lowest overall approval. Now, he doesn't have the worst net approval, but just in terms of his overall, and really a lot of this has name recognition built into it, but very low overall awareness of him in comparison to a lot of these other Senate candidates that are running, which is going to make things a little bit tougher, not quite as strong of an incumbency advantage as a result. Expect this one to be extremely close, but until I get more information on who the Democratic Party nominee is going to be or more polling, going to be giving this one as a lean over to the Republicans. And then we move over to the state of Kentucky. Mitch McConnell, the Republican incumbent, who has by far the worst negative net approval of any senator in the entire U.S. Senate. That's 100 senators. Mitch McConnell, by far the worst. So you'd think, well, that's going to be an easy one for the Democrats. Well, that's not really likely to be the case because Kentucky, strong lean to the Republicans in general in these statewide races, especially on the federal level. Donald Trump, very popular in the state of Kentucky. That's likely to rise the tide of all of the other Republicans down ballot, which should help Mitch McConnell at the end of the day. Now, Amy McGrath, she's going to be running on the Democratic side to win the nominee. I don't think she's necessarily the strongest candidate. She's one of these politicians that just tends to play to the room that she's in, and I don't think she's necessarily the most authentic because of that. I think that hurts her in what's becoming a more modern day politics where a lot of voters really care about authenticity. Now, the Democrats could run some other people, maybe a Rocky Atkins, maybe a Matt Jones. We'll see how it plays out on their side and who the party nominee ends up being. McConnell, he's not going to have any shortage in terms of funds to try to win his reelection, but even the fact that he is extremely disliked, and you see that with his very net negative approval numbers, still going to be giving him the lean to win this one, especially with it being a presidential year where Trump is likely to do very well in the state of Kentucky and likely benefit McConnell on his way to winning the state. Now, going up a couple of states here into the Midwest, the state of Michigan. It would be a surprise if Gary Peters didn't go on and win his reelection, but kind of like a Thom Tillis situation, very low in terms of his overall approval numbers. Now, he doesn't have terrible disapproval numbers either, but when you have general lower name recognition or just not much of a presence in the state, people don't know you quite as much as some of these other incumbent candidates, that reduces your incumbency advantage. Gary Peters has been doing a good job of raising money, which is going to help as he tries to go on and win this Senate seat. Now, John James could very well be his opponent on the Republican side. John James ran against Debbie Stabenow in 2018. He actually did a bit better than I was expecting him to do, but lost by around 6 or 7 percentage points in a 2020 presidential year, which typically helps Democrats, especially in a state like Michigan. Maybe not necessarily the case from what we saw in 2016, where Trump was able to defeat Clinton in the state of Michigan. But what we saw in the 2018 midterms, very strong indications for Michigan Democrats. Gary Peters, not necessarily the most beloved Democrat by any means, very corporate in nature, but still at the end of the day, going to be giving him a couple of leans over, not the light blue, but one spot over from that. It, again, would be a surprise. Michigan in general statewide goes to Democrats, especially on the federal level in presidential years. And then we go over to New Hampshire and Maine, the last two states. New Hampshire, Jeanne Shaheen, The incumbent Democrat, she's actually looking really strong to go on and win her re-election bid here because her net approval are actually extremely high and very positive, which is a great sign for her. We don't know who she's going to be running against necessarily, but also, even if we're looking at this from a presidential lens, Trump, one of his worst net approval ratings comes in a state like New Hampshire, which is likely to help the Democrats win this one at the end of the day. And then we go up to the state of Maine, where you have the Republican incumbent, Susan Collins, who has seen her net approval numbers completely tank ever since the whole Brett Kavanaugh scenario. And that's looking really good, opening the doors up for the Democrats to try and flip this one. And again, it's another one of these situations where we don't know who the Democratic nominee is going to be, but Collins is very vulnerable in a state where the statewide elections, especially on the federal level, tend to go Democratic. I actually give this one as a lean over to the Democrats. They're fundraising very strong for the Democrats for this Senate seat because there's a lot of motivation based on how Collins acted and went along with the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh, which didn't sit well, clearly with a lot of voters in Maine, as we see her numbers have gone in the tank in terms of her overall approval. So that's where I currently have the Senate map standing. 49 seats for the Democrats, 51 seats for the Republicans. This would be a disaster or a really feels bad moment for the Democrats if they were able to win the presidency, but then they came up one Senate seat short, which would mean if we go back to 2018, they lost a number of incumbencies in states like Florida, Missouri, Indiana. If they would have just been able to hold on to one of those, it would have been a 50-50 scenario. Now, you can see there's a ton of these races that are going to be competitive. Of all of the races where I currently have leans over to the Republicans, I think the Democrats' best case to get to 50 Senate seats might be picking up North Carolina, and then behind that, I'd have possibly Iowa and then Georgia. I think that those are three races that are very gettable potentially for the Democrats, depending on who they nominate. Maybe even a Texas. Alabama, who knows? A crazy thing happened there in the special election with Doug Jones winning. Maybe he's able to have another crazy win for the Democrats in a statewide race in Alabama. And maybe that's not completely out of the realm of possibility because Doug Jones, he's at least positive in his net overall approval numbers in his home state of Alabama, so he has at least that to build off of. But I'm just continuing to ramble on here. I think it's about time that I wrapped this one up. So that's where I currently have things standing, guys. 49 seats for the Democrats, 51 for the Republicans, but with a lot of seats that could potentially be flipped over to the Democrats to where they could get to the majority, or maybe even the Republicans surprise and are able to hold on to the incumbencies that they currently have in states like Maine, Colorado, or maybe even another bigger surprise, and that would possibly be even the state of Arizona. So that's going to wrap this one up, guys. Thanks for stopping by. Consider subscribing for more. Hope to see you guys back here for future videos.